I just
Yeah, you're fine. I've definitely had some of these interviews I've had like at bars while I was drinking. I've had them in busy
Oh,
streets.
okay.
So
Yeah.
trust me, pretty much
Okay,
anything's fine.
perfect. I have my phone on the table on speaker, so I hope you don't hear an echo or anything.
I'm sure it'll be fine. But
Okay.
first off, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me.
Thank you so much for your channel in general. You are doing, I don't want to say God's work, but just so much work for our community. I really admire everything that you put in.
Well, see, if I didn't make a channel about it, then I just annoy everyone around me when I start going on rants about it. So this is me trying to spare my friends and family from me bombarding them with the depressingness of radical feminism all the time.
I understand that. Perfect way to vent. Absolutely valid.
But so recently this semester I've been taking a philosophy course. It's an intro to philosophy course, which I've already taken. I'm just retaking it because I transferred schools.
Mhm.
And I started looking into postmodernism because we brought up like philosophy of feminism a little bit. And those things kind of overlapped because postmodernism has affected the direction that feminism has gone. And I wanted to learn more about it, but it was really, really confusing. Like even like researching it on my own, I was sitting there squinting most of the time going, "What does this mean?"
Yes, absolutely.
And I've heard that you have some expertise on the topic.
Yeah, so I'm writing my bachelor's thesis on postmodernism versus critical schools of philosophy. I'm also finishing university this year, so I'm kind of specialized on the subject. I've been reading a lot of stuff about this, also personally. Plus, I actually studied gender studies for a year or so.
Oh my gosh, you did?
I did. It was horrific, but I made it out alive with good grades, so I guess that's all that counts.
Honestly, I mean, I've heard of people taking gender studies, but I haven't met anyone who has, and definitely no one with a radical feminist perspective. What was that like?
Um, it was hard listening to a completely ideological perspective in an academic setting, I have to be honest, because I'm at a very conservative university that's it's very high up, very elite type stuff, which I'm personally not proud of, but that's kind of the setting I'm in, you know what I mean? So, really being confronted with, I don't want to say people with badly colored hair, but I kind of want to say it, just like people with badly colored hair and like piercings who are like arguing from a completely ideological perspective about my life. That was psychologically kind of hard to take because there was a lot of lesbian bashing going on, a lot of anti-turf and very overdramatic rhetoric. I guess it was interesting to really learn their talking points, and in the end, I think that these people believe they're doing the morally right thing, which I actually respect. And I thought it was also refreshing to step out of my own bubble and learn a perspective that isn't my own and that I will never have. But that really helped me to argue against them, I suppose.
Well, you know what they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
I mean, I have to admit, I transferred out of a liberal arts college last spring. First of all, I didn't like the environment. I got so tired of, like, as you said, the bad dye job people with the horrible opinions. I'm loud
Mhm.
and annoying, as you can tell by my channel. So I always started fights in classrooms over like female oppression is a real thing. Like I was that person who would always somehow bring it back to feminism. Part of it was because there's this one white dude in my class who was just really, really annoying. Like, he tried to argue that diabetics shouldn't have affordable insulin because the manufacturers deserve to get a profit. And I was like, excuse me. 17-year diagnosed diabetic here. Let me go ahead and prove you wrong. And from that day
Yeah.
forward, I had to be the most annoying person in class. But I transferred out of that college because of people like that who were kind of like, I understand they have good intentions, but it doesn't make what they're doing any less harmful, you know? And of course, I feel like with female socialization, we don't want to hurt other people's feelings. We don't inherently want to be mean. And it was really hard to balance. I don't want to be mean to people who really aren't trying to be bad people, but I also can't stand hearing this stuff all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the capitalist individualism for me that made it so hard to tolerate. I was kind of fascinated because in my normal studies, basically in philosophy, I do have a lot of more conservative people, and you're not really allowed to voice your opinion. There just isn't time for it, and there are so many steps to take to really learn about theory and practice theory that your own opinion doesn't play that big of a role. The difference in gender studies was really the individualistic perspective of these people who I could just see them sitting there like shivering visibly because they wanted to say something so bad, and they would like get annoyed raising their hands because they couldn't immediately speak. There was a lot of narcissism going on, so that was to me the biggest just difference and difference in perspective, I guess, in gender studies, like the individualism.
Hmm. Because you see, I really think that individualism is one of the it's really one of the things that's ruined class consciousness, movements that are driven by class consciousness, which was most of them really. I mean, I even think honestly that sometimes like the Black Lives Matter movement was kind of ruined by it too, because I know that this isn't really the topic, but I remember just looking at all these different organizations that threw up, that were made, and they got all this funding, and everyone did this thing where they would do like the bare minimum of not doing anything, posting black squares in their Instagram, or wearing a t-shirt or something, or putting a sticker on their car. And the organizations that did rise up, I remember one of them got in trouble earlier this year because all the money was spent for like personal reasons. And I don't think any of them went to jail for it either. Like it wasn't any collective ideology. There wasn't any collectiveness there. There wasn't any, let's think of people as a group, let's think of each other as being one with one another. And that's especially true for feminism because, like, Lord, trying to debate with someone, like, are you sure that you really enjoy having 5-inch long nails? I do it for me. Do you do it for you? What are
Mm,
you sure you do it for you?
mm, yeah, absolutely. I agree about the class consciousness aspect. Actually, just to go back on topic a bit, I found it very like interesting once I found out that gender studies used to be women's studies. I think gender studies was invented or coined in an academic setting around 2010-ish, maybe. And before that, women's studies was so important because women weren't allowed at university and were very much looked down upon and discluded from also philosophical topics. And we were having quite the discussion about this in our DMs as well. So once I found that out, I was taken aback by the fact that something, women's studies wasn't a topic that or a subject that you could study as a whole, but it was this environment where women could come together and discuss their oppression in academics, in universities, and try to find their voice in a feminist sense and just like build activist bonding and activities, groups, and stuff like that. And now, gender studies is you can study it to a master's degree, if I'm not mistaken. That has completely changed. So I think the view on it is people think that they are doing something very activisty by studying gender studies when truthfully they are writing over women's history, women's voices, and adding a subject that is not scientific at all, which makes all other social subjects look bad in turn, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Honestly, I think you're really great at explaining difficult concepts. Like, once you finish your thesis, I actually want to read it because, like, you managed to very thoroughly explain postmodernism to me in a way that, like, I, someone who kind of hates philosophy class, really understood and it made sense too. So,
Thank you. It's the autism.
well, I really do like what you wrote, and I don't think I mentioned this in the video, but you were definitely a
Mhm.
great help with my postmodernism is not feminist video. So just want to put that out there.
I love that video. I thought the research he put into Foucault was so interesting because his way of writing about power and power dynamics was kind of clear to me, but you put it out there in such a concise way. I really enjoyed listening to you kind of translating. How do I say this? Like, Foucault as a philosopher has such a complicated way of writing when he's just observing very simple things. A lot of philosophers are like that, and I mostly enjoyed that part about your video because it really made me reflect on my own. I was like, yes, I mean, that is what he was writing about, and sometimes it's easy to get lost in certain dynamics.
Oh, I mean, thank you, because I tried because I know that sometimes it's easy to ignore topics like this, like when you're on the ground, fighting for a feminist praxis, you're going for we need to work on period poverty, we need to work on these specific issues, like how there's a femicide epidemic in Mexico. We need to work on these specific real world issues, and ideology does drive our reality a lot more than we realize. And
Mhm.
people like we kind of have this anti-intellectualism movement going on, especially online where like especially in the TRA movement where they'll even go as far as to deny sex is real. And I think it's really important to point out where this like type of thought comes from because as much as we like to pretend that academia and the real world are kind of separate, they're not. One feeds into another. It's like a cycle. It's an Ouroboros. They eat each other. It's one loop.
Yes, it is amazing you would say that just because when I think about, for example, liberal feminism and academia, what comes to mind is that language, also from a postmodernist perspective, is becoming so much more complicated, and that in and of itself is a class problem. I'm from Germany, so in Germany, um, this movement, like liberal feminism, is trying to actively change language in ways where I don't think it's that much of a bad idea. I'm not going to combat them over it, but it does make language a harder barrier for people who didn't grow up speaking German or who are working class. And that's something that I run into a lot when I'm speaking about these kind of things with my friends or just, people who are working class and who aren't totally in this field. It's complicated to them, and they're scared to talk about class rights, class consciousness, because they think they're going to say something wrong. Which to me, especially women, it, like breaks my heart because I'm always like, this movement is for you. It's for all of us. It's not meant to be so academized in this small bell jar of people making the rules for society. And from a Marxist perspective, that also doesn't make sense at all. I think especially feminism has to be working class and it has to be class conscious. I mean, my perspective in radical feminism, for example, is that women are a class, women are a social class, and that's why they are being oppressed by men as a class who have class consciousness, unlike we do. So, by trivializing language so much, we're making it easier for conservatives and those who are selling easy to understand propagandistic language to be louder than us, to be heard.
I think that really ties into how like the liberal feminist movement has all these really catchy, easy slogans. Sex work is work. Trans women are women. They're these really short, pithy little things that are super easy to say. And I think that especially because of how our attention spans have decreased because of our internet usage. And I hate to say it, I sound like a boomer sometimes when I try to explain this, but it's true. Like
Yeah.
the shorter something is, the more likely it is we're going to believe it. And of course, when you hear it everywhere, it's well, if everyone else thinks it's true, it's got to be true. And we don't really have any, short pithy slogans. We don't have anything. We have these concise, well, researched arguments, but you have to be willing to read those well-researched arguments. You have to be willing to, like, especially with radical feminism, I've seen people explain really tough, like, concepts, but in normal language, conversational language, which I think is a plus, but you often have to want to seek it out in order to even be, influenced by it, to even see it.
Yeah. In general, when we're speaking about politics, nobody wants to read theory anymore, especially when it comes to Marxism. I think that's a major problem the left has because the left is such a young movement. Like, there are just so many young people involved in anti-fascist circles. And, like, by the way, I think being part of the left in Germany is kind of less based on gender and more based on being clearly anti-fascist, which is why I've always been extremely leftist. And the oversimplification of language is a problem because at the same time, when you're delving into theory and using theoretical language, it does make it harder for everyone else to basically speak with you. You can just like easily play moral police because you know the right vocabulary to do so. And at the same time, that's such a struggle for radical feminism. I have often read radical feminists are nerds. Like, they read so many books. It's so awkward. And that always has me thinking, like, okay, y'all really hate women who read and who, like, have knowledge, which isn't just based on, speaking and, like, sharing TikTok videos and stuff like that. At the same time, that makes it less marketable under capitalism. And that's actually the reason radical feminism is not a popular movement, in my opinion. Like, I went to school for graphic design and marketing before I started studying philosophy. And what I found so interesting about feminism is that, I mean, you know this, but of course, the feminism we have right now it's so big because of capitalism, because for example, beauty products can be marketed easily when you're using feminist language, and just sex work, prostitution can be marketed towards young people with like OnlyFans, where women are infecting each other or themselves with this kind of ideology and speech because it's easy to do so. You're basically greenlighting yourself. You're saying, "Oh, I'm morally correct by using a certain vocabulary and just like yeah, propagandistic words." And then you turn around and radical feminism has this huge problem where to really be a radical feminist, I think you do have to have read a lot of Dworkin's work, for example. That's what a lot of theory is based on. And without this theoretical knowledge, I know so many women who could be radical feminists, they don't call themselves that because they haven't read enough theory yet. And I personally find that far more respectable than when you just walk into a movement and say, "Oh, I am objectively right just because I'm using the right language," which is also a very postmodernist approach, like linguistic deconstruction and applying moral benefits and problems to language in and of itself. That is essentially what postmodernism is, right?
Well, I think you know that quote by Dworkin. Many women, I think, resist feminism because it is an agony to be fully conscious of the brutal misogyny which permeates culture, society, and all personal relationships.
Yes.
This is it's always true, and I think especially with, like you said, with liberal feminism, it's really easy to just, okay, I'm feminist now because I'm using the feminist razor. I'm buying the feminist product, so I'm doing the activism. And of course, like you said, I mean, I think that you can definitely take steps towards learning radical feminism via, seeing YouTube videos and reading Tumblr posts, because that's kind of how I already had radical feminist views. I just didn't have a name for it. And then one day I started reading someone's blog and I was like, oh, there's a name for it. And I feel like there's probably a lot of normal women who are just there and not terminally online, who probably feel the same and just haven't realized it. And I mean, but there's a difference between having some radical feminist leanings and then being well versed in the literature, because I mean, like I said, when you're well versed, and it takes effort, first of all. You can't just skim these books, you have to actually read them. And then it's agony because the more you read them, the more you're aware of just how messed up the world is, honestly.
Yes, at the same time, though, reading Dworkin is so I feel so seen and so heard by her. This is a general thing for me with philosophy, which is why I'm studying it. Like when I read theory, I just feel like I'm not as alone anymore. And so many people, and in our case, women, have had the same thoughts and have gone through the same thing. I think we all know that a lot of radical feminists are radical feminists because they've gone through rape, essentially. I hope I'm allowed to say that through sexual assault. Sorry about that.
No, it's
But
fine. As long as we don't use
okay,
any of the big cuss words, we're good.
okay, perfect. So that's a background where a lot of women come from, and that's the reason so many of us feel drawn towards this movement because women's rights had become so important to us at a pretty young age, right? And I remember when I was first understanding that my views were very radical and were not tolerated by liberal feminism because I don't think that it's very possible for men to be feminists, and I do know that a lot of leftist men use feminism in order to position themselves as someone you can trust. Like that's a huge problem in liberal feminist circles, and I guess understanding all of these things and really observing how oppression works in the private and political, which is a huge thing in radical feminism. Like the private always is political. Like you can do all the activism in the world, but if, as a man, right, essentially, if your wife is cleaning and cooking for you, then you just cannot call yourself an ally. Like that's not possible.
And I think a lot of guys have fallen into this performatism of it. Like they've realized I'm taking advantage of this because God, I see guys with like painted fingernails all the time. That's it. Nothing else. Nothing else vaguely feminine about them. They don't do earrings. They don't do feminine clothing. They just paint their fingernails, and that's like a virtue signaling right there. That like, look, I'm a leftist liberal guy. But half of those guys don't even know how to use a broom. And
Oh,
even if
yes.
they do, they're not going to. Like that's just you're not breaking any gender stereotypes or gender norms because he's painting his nails. Have him clean the damn toilet. That's way more useful than him painting his nails. He's not going to get in trouble for it. There's not going to be any gender police arresting him for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
I
not
also
revolutionary, you know?
absolutely like. I think Marx is an example that is named so much in this, right? Because while Marx was writing his books, his wife, by the way, was an incredibly intelligent woman. I don't know if you've seen her letters or her writing, but you can really see her influence in his writing, basically. I mean, he was like discussing all of these things with her, and she had such an interesting view on the world. And from the perspective as a woman, Marx was against prostitution because he spoke to his wife about these things. At the same time, she was cooking, she was cleaning the house, taking care of everything. And the only reason we have his theory really is because she made it possible by being there for him. And honestly, I would rather have her as a philosopher to be able to speak about her. I think it's sad that because of that, she wasn't able to write her own work. I wish she would have, because the way she writes is just so beautiful and her feminist perspective is so unique. Yeah, I wish she would have had a chance.
I feel like it's a common thing throughout history is that, behind every great man is a really great woman who kept like someone had to run the house, someone had to do all these basic things because men were basically like babies who couldn't feed themselves. I mean, it's really sad to think about how many women were lost to marriage whose great minds
Hmm.
we'll never hear of because they got married and had kids and they weren't able to be independent because of that. They didn't have a room for themselves or the ability to write.
Hmm. Yes. To build a bridge basically back to postmodernism, I also would kind of add that when postmodernism was first coined, or, when Foucault was writing his books, this was the time, and we spoke about this in the DMs too, by the way. This was after the Second World War, and for Europe, it was very hopeful time. Like everybody was hoping things were going to get better, and like the Nazi regime had been defeated. The problem was that women were such a major backbone of society, and when it came to theoretical literature, we had a lot of men who were able to analyze power and analyze racism and anti Semitism as they should, by the way. At the same time, for some reason, they weren't able to turn around and really transfer their beliefs about power onto their private lives, which is such a strange development when you're a woman and reading about all these things and really trying to understand the history of feminism and also your own history and how you're tied into philosophy and that kind of stuff. It's really eye-opening to discover that these times where, you know, people were hopeful and blah blah blah, there was so much theory going around, women barely had a part in that, where actually at the same time radical feminism was becoming quite the movement, right, in the 70s. So I think that what that is, there was a good reason for that. Women wanted to write theory, and that's where radical feminism came into the picture in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, something that's been really something that I've been really stuck on with postmodernism is it's all theoretical. Like it doesn't work if you're grounded in like if you're living, in reality. Like it's really easy to pretend that certain things don't exist as long as you're separate from those issues. It kind of feels like philosophers and like the White Castle making all these judgments about the world at large without actually understanding like misogyny or racism or just pretty much anything that's not class based.
Hmm. Yeah, because it's comfortable, basically. I also think Judith Butler, for example, right?
Oh
She
gosh.
for sure had good intentions, and we already spoke about how the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I do think her work is, um, it's obvious that she had good intentions using basically big words and a very big way of writing, where she was trying to mimic a lot of the other bigger philosophers, which when I read her work, I can identify with that, to use that word, right? Like I know how it is as a woman when you're writing philosophical literature, where you have to really use everything you've learned just to have the same grade as some guy who doesn't really have anything to say, but he's just there, and you know he's getting all of this popularity because of that, but you really have to work on your own vocabulary and basically hide behind big words, which I do understand about postmodernism. Like this is such a literary based way of thinking and way of viewing morality. Like postmodernism is based on this idea that morality is completely subjectively linked to language, and that the way that we speak and how we view things is more important than objective reality. I mean, the philosophical question, is there objective reality, is like this whole, it's like an epistemical discussion. That's a whole different can of worms, which I don't think we have the time to open today. But yeah, like that's basically such an interesting development in philosophy, as a lot of other schools are being left behind because it's more convenient to be able to speak about language and speak about things which are actually transferable to our own lives. Like it's complicated to think about the nature of reality and epistemology, and you know, if anything is real or if ideas even exist and that kind of thing. And now we have postmodernism, which is giving you easy answers, which sound great, though, right? Because there's this language around it, which is just so romanticizing, and it sounds amazing and just hopeful and liberating to have all of these ideas where we can combat oppression just by easily using these band-aids for language, band-aids for like uh, just very just things that don't run that deep in our society. And I think language is a good example for that, because language can be changed relatively easily, as we can see in culture and language, how language influences culture and culture influences language. There is a lot to be said about that. But of course, I think we both know as materialists, basically, that you can't change as really objective reality and certain things that we are very sure of biologically by saying that language is morally above that and has the power to morally point a finger at objective reality and say, no, you like this has to change because it has unfair consequences in our society.
Yeah, and I mean, personally, I don't understand. I mean, I guess I do. People tend to follow whatever is easiest and whatever is popular. So I guess I get the gist of how you get to that point of believing in words impact reality, but it just feels like everyone really wants to be not here. You know, everyone wants
Mm-hmm.
escapism really, really bad. Like no one want like everyone is like for the past, it's gonna be 3 years soon. Wow, but the past 2, 3 years of pandemic and recovery and all this stuff, we've had all these trends of like cottage core and like wanting to live a better life and all this stuff and spending more time online, specifically. And it's because we don't like the lives that we're living. And I think materialism is like it's unwelcome because it reminds you that we are still living in that world, no matter how much you try to pretend your way out of it or pretend it's not there. We're still living in it, and it's
Mm.
really inconvenient because it's just like okay, yeah, I'm living in a world I don't like. Do you want to just pretend it's not there? Or do you want to fix it?
Girl, don't even get me started on cottagecore. That is, oh my God. Okay, I think TikTok plays such a major role. Not just TikTok, I think social media in general plays such a major role in which philosophy has become a trend basically throughout the last few years. And I do think, like, okay, as I said, like convenience is so important to postmodernism, because postmodernism, if it's based on language and we can take language and use it to spread popular themes and popular beliefs, and we have this kind of, as you said, we want a feel good society, like we want to feel good about ourselves, and the easiest way to believe that what you're doing is morally right is by saying like mm, if everybody can choose what they want and if everything goes, then I can just say, every choice that a human being makes is the right thing. And this is actually something I really wanted to speak about today. I sent you that book by Book Hoshin. It's from 2008, called Fear of Knowledge, and he talks about the equal validity theory, or theory of equal validity, however way you want to say it, which is the postmodern belief that every theory, no matter if it's scientific or not, or even linguistic theory and scientific theory are basically on the same scale. Like, especially morally speaking, one theory is not above the other. So that's where we really get this notion that anybody can have any kink and everything is valid. You can be misogynist, or as long as it's in the bedroom, basically, or consensual, then anything goes. And the same, of course, applies to feminism. Like, if a woman chooses to enter prostitution and be part of a system where most women are trafficked into prostitution. Like, I live in a country where prostitution is legal, and I am friends with many ex-prostitutes, and a big part of my activism is basically connecting with other women who are interested in helping women escape prostitution and escape human trafficking and things like that. And we're often attacked by women, actually. It's mostly women who get really angry at us because they're like, well, what if a woman chooses this as a choice? And I think it's so remarkable that equal validity has become our moral standard practice. Like it's hard to be a person who has moral values and says no, not everything is correct. Like I actually have boundaries in my beliefs, and I do think that people can make the wrong decision because people are fallible, right? And a lot of like feminists don't believe that anymore. Feminists want to believe that anything goes and anything is okay as long as it's been deconstructed in a feminist sense, kind of, not in a materialistic sense. Because if you were to be a materialist, you would be able to see, okay, human trafficking is a problem, and also a lot of children are being trafficked into prostitution. So this is something where we as a society should be against it. But instead, we've arrived at this weird point where, because of equal validity, now we just go, okay, well, as long as like 3% of women choose it and like 97% are trafficked, but they don't matter. We're just gonna throw them away. We're just gonna like discard everything they have to say and just ignore it. We're going to concentrate on the 3% of women who actively made this choice for whatever reason at all. When, from a materialistic perspective, it's not really about the women. For me, for example, it's more about, Johns. Like, why are men even going to prostitutes? Why do men always want to be able to touch a woman, to have sex with a woman? Why do men think that they have the right to always have sex with a woman or touch a woman? Like, why has our society arrived at that kind of point? But that's really uncomfortable, because then the consequence would be, oh shit, like, oh, sorry, my friends have done this as well. Like, my friends have gone to prostitutes, or my brother or my uncle are part of the system, and they're part of my own oppression, so I can't trust them. And no matter what kind of perspective you choose to take in a materialistic world, the end is always that you cannot trust a lot of people, especially not men. And feminists don't want to believe that. Feminists want to have this comfortable notion that, men can be feminists and feminism can be marketable, and all of these problems don't have to exist as long as we make the choice that they don't exist.
Yeah, you put it well. I mean, that's something that's I feel like I've discussed this with other guests before, but I know that there's quite a few radical feminists who are bisexual and het partnered. And to an extent, it kind of confuses me because I see a lot of het women who just decide, they're in radical feminism. They decide, you know what, I'm just not going to date. Complete separatism from men. I'd rather just hang out with my best friends or be single or whatever. But even though, everyone knows the talking points. Everyone knows, how dangerous it is to have a man in your household. How much more likely you are to be murdered. Even because everyone thinks that their guy is the exception. And
Mm.
that can't be true for everyone. And it's just something that's kind of interesting to me because I kind of see what you were saying, like reflected even in the movement of women will like they'll say, after this one, no more, I'm not going back, or this one's the exception. And like I said, I don't think that you have to be ideologically pure in every sense. I don't expect every woman to just give up, the guys in their life. But I do think it's interesting how a lot of bisexual women, who are especially younger ones, who aren't married or anything, you're just dating them, they will make this kind of loophole for their one guy, and they'll kind of forget about, don't want to think about how he might be just like all the other guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I listened to that episode. I remember it. And I do remember that I actually disagreed with most of the talking points I heard in there. Like, I do respect that a lot of radical feminists have a problem with that and, want to really reach and grasp this separatist society. But especially because in a materialistic world, as you said, we can't all be ideologically pure. I think that it's very hard to put that kind of pressure onto women who are just who ultimately want to find love. And I know this is so sappy, but really all humans want is to have love and connection, and that goes for heterosexual and bisexual women just as much as it does go for men. Like, I'm sorry, but also as a radical feminist, this is maybe a very unpopular talking point, but I do have male friends with whom I discuss theory, who read theory, and who, for example, don't watch porn and are very anti-porn, who are very anti-trafficking and prostitution and things like that. And I have extremely respectable women around me. Like, my friends who are women are so amazing and so enriching to me because they have interesting perspectives about their own relationships, where I think they're really smart and they know where it's at. Like, I think they're kind of dominant in a sense. Like, they know what they're doing. And I kind of have a problem with this notion that, bisexual and heterosexual women are like always vulnerable. And I mean, it's more likely for them to become victims. At the same time, all we can do to hinder that is to build a safety net. I don't think it's, we can just like ideologically say, okay, well, it's wrong that you're dating men, that you want to have a life with a man. I think it's way more important that we practice a form of separatism ourselves, where instead of dividing our community, we actually build the safety net where also as lesbians, we have to be really involved in that kind of stuff. Like, my female friends, we call each other when we're on our way home, and we just really try to take care of each other when we're at parties and stuff like that. And I do think that that kind of, in our materialistic world, that's far more important to me than going, well, I have a problem with the fact that you're dating a man. I actually don't really care about that at all. Like, yeah.
Well, I agree with you. I think that for one, I understand why some people will harshly criticize or even like I understand why we have infighting in the community even. I do think that there's a
Mhm.
certain sort of realism you need to take with all activism. Like, I don't think that in my lifetime we're going to completely reverse sexism and misogyny. That's just an unrealistic goal. And I don't think that it makes any sense to strive for every woman should be separatist because that's not going to work either. And even in the community, I'd say it's not realistic. And I agree with you. I think that it's important to, as women, protect each other and offer safety nets. I find it interesting. Just I don't know. I do think as lesbians we have it a bit easier. I don't have any real use for guys in my life. I have a couple. Well, I have a singular guy friend I've known for forever. And I guess that goes to show that like we all have our excuses. We all have our, you know, exceptions to this, this
Mhm.
ideology.
Mhm.
It's just something that I don't know. It's just something that does sort of frighten me, though. Is that just friends that I care about? I mean, I know that there are men out there who are not completely awful, obviously, and of
Mhm.
course, I think that there's room for improvement. I think that sometimes we go a little bit too fatalist with it. I've heard plenty of women argue that, well, we can't fix the men. We should just leave them alone and let them, die off, or we should just separate on our own and let them, screw each other over. But I have to believe that we have, some room for improvement. I have to believe that it's not all nature, that it's mostly nurture. I have to believe you have to believe that because where else do you go? It's not realistic to think that we're gonna ever be able to until we get to like Starship Point where we can go to a planet of women. We're not gonna be able to ever enact a fully separatist society that because for one we need them for reproduction, of course, but also just it's unrealistic.
I think this is the most, like, the biggest underlying problem of radical feminism is that we we're having huge trouble choosing a path that we want to go. I think a lot of radical feminists are idealistic, but a lot of us have different ideas about what that ideology is supposed to entail, also in a moralistic sense. And for me, basically, like, how do you end that? Like, how do you solve that question? I think we have to meet each other halfway. Like, for example, I spend a lot of time thinking about I think our world would be so much better if we had a curfew for men. Like, okay, hold on. Like, this is a lot of people start getting really like, oh, okay, well, you're entering dangerous territory there. And I know, but I think a curfew for dangerous men, first of all, men who have already harmed women would be brilliant. And then, we could have this kind of system where you have like a test where a man really has to show, okay, well, I'm not going to drag a woman into an alley and hurt her or something, or just like also women I know I haven't harmed them, and then these men would still be allowed to leave the house after dark, but like in a very radical feminist, perfect ideology, I think that many men would have to be excluded from society. I don't know if separatism is the answer. I think like society itself has to become more separatist and value women more, so that we are on the same level as men. I think that that's what Valerie Solanas really, okay, this is like controversial, but whatever. I think what she really wanted to achieve was to write about men the same way that men write about women. And I understand the thought process behind that. Like, if you want women to be liberated, you really have to reach for the stars and not just the sky. Like, you have to go above and beyond and really instill rules that we haven't had yet as a society, because right now we live in a world where in many countries women do not have access to education and just like don't have access to materialistic goods and things that men have always had access to. There would be a revolution if men didn't have access to specific things. I know that a lot of men are poor as well. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is that there's a difference between a sexist world where women are being stopped, prohibited from going to school on purpose. As Marxist, of course, class struggles are almost as important to me as women's struggles are as a whole. And I do understand that, but I think it's such an interesting thought process to think about the fact that if we really want to achieve equal rights, we can't just reach for equal rights. We have to reach for or strive for more rights. And that's kind of the point where um, people from outside our ideology get scared away because they're like, oh, okay, well, you must hate men if you're saying this kind of thing. They don't understand that I'm just saying it because I actually just love women and prioritize women in every way in my day-to-day life. And to me, to if we had like an equal society, everybody would actually have to prioritize women as well.
I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, we do prioritize men in life in general. I mean, as a society at least, and just considering us on the same equal ground would be a huge step forward for sure.
Hmm.
I mean, I do think that it's going to be impossible to ever get to even within radical feminism. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we all agree on a specific path forward or a specific goal. I mean, we all have things that are like I know I was talking to someone on Tumblr, anti-porn activist, and she
Oh.
was talking about how she didn't necessarily align with the radical feminist title because some people didn't consider her one because she had a son and a husband, but she was still spending a lot of her time and years of her life working against porn. And
Hmm.
I think to a certain degree, I think it's fine for us to separate and focus on specific goals. I know that at the very least they're all leading towards women's liberation. So if some women are not, they're not fully on board with everything, but they're working towards getting rid of porn or prostitution, that's still useful. That's still helpful. If you just specifically want to work on, I don't know, you want to work on lesbian activism, that's still useful. That's still women. That's still helpful. Every little bit helps, especially because we're such a like I say small, but we're large. We just don't have a big voice. We don't have any real influence over government. I think that in other countries they do a bit better. I think especially with like Spain, they're doing a bit better at influencing things. But at least in the States, and for a lot of what I hear about in Europe, you don't really
Hmm.
have that same influence over government changes as other groups do. And so a lot of change that we are enacting is personal. It's going to be what each individual considers to be most important to them. or some women that might be, having workshops in the community to make other women and girls more independent, be able to do household chores and whatnot. For others, it might be working in a shelter. In the end, I think that the most important thing is that we are all working towards the same broad end goal, no matter how far away that goal is. I just don't think we're ever
Yes.
going to be able to get into one boat and agree on things because, I mean, hell, look at the people have been arguing over separatism since like what, the 70s. It's just like there's some
Mhm.
arguments that would just come and go like a cycle. They're never going to go away.
First of all, it's amazing that you spoke to anti-porn activists. This is a bit of a tangent. I'm just going to keep it short, but when I was on Tumblr as a teen, I think I was around 15 or 16, this edgy BDSM stuff was all over my dashboard, and there was a lot of DDLG content basically being thrown at me, and I was already very critical of it at the time. And I remember I discovered her blog, and it was such an amazing safe space to me. That was actually, I followed a bunch of Radfems because of her, and when I was around 17, they were all canceled for being TERFs and stuff, and that was basically my first confrontation with all of this. And kudos to her. Like, I know she piqued a lot of people without even being a radical feminist, and her blog is really what made me feel safe in an environment where, I was sexually assaulted around 15, around the time where all this stuff was being thrown at me on my dashboard. And seeing a woman who is just so smart and so well spoken, taking a stand against it was really what influenced me to, I think, really like go into politics and, and philosophy as well. She's amazing. It's so cool that you spoke to her. I'm like shook right now.
Well, it was
But
only a written interview. She wasn't comfortable with having
mhm.
anything recorded verbally, but I do hope to compile that into a sort of article.
Yes,
Because like
yes.
she really has been influential. I mean, I remember when I last year I was trying to convince my friends to give up, porn. Like even as females, they were still
Hmm.
into that, and I was trying to explain, and it was so funny to me that the first time I brought up the subject, they were like, "Well, you read fan fiction, so it's the same thing. You're being a hypocrite." No, it's
Mm.
not. Fan fiction is not the same. And then like a little while later, I had like one of those long infographics on why porn and prostitution are bad and harmful. And she
Hmm.
actually read through all of it, and at the end of that, my friend changed her mind. It took one day of her reading through all those compiled sources and realizing, oh
Hmm.
shit, this is actually a bad thing. I actually
Yes.
should stop doing this. And I think
Yes.
that for a lot of people, that's like a great starting point because it's so factual, it's so easy to read. It's so straightforward. But like, I mean, you can be willfully ignorant, obviously. I know a lot of people who are like, well, I like it enough that I'm just not going to give it up, even if it harms me. Like with smokers.
Mm.
Like, you know that smoking's not good for you, but you're still going to do it anyway because you like it. And the only difference, I suppose, is that smoking only harms you, maybe whoever you're sharing a car with, while consuming pornography hurts women in general.
Yes.
And I do
Same
think that
here.
it's. Oh, go ahead.
Well, same here. I have sent her blog to so many of my friends to pique them. Also to liberal feminists who start arguing with me on like Instagram or other social medias. I just tend to send them. She has like this huge master post. It's like this anti-porn master post. I'll just send that over and call it a day. Perfect resource.
I mean, honestly, it is. That's one thing that I do like about it. Like, I'm not gonna say, I probably have already revealed that I spend way too much time on Tumblr. Like, I've been on there since I was like 11. But the fact that we have so many people on there who, I mean, everyone seems to know them when I bring them on to interviews. So obviously they're not completely obscure. But it's interpersonal relationships that really make a difference, I think. Especially with how liberal feminism kind of spreads, like it's kind of something that your friends correct you on and then you just get on board with it and you just kind of keep going forward like because it's just what everyone else around you is saying. And then radical feminism, you kind of need someone to hold your hand and introduce you to it
Mm,
in some way or shape or form, be it
mm,
someone on your dashboard arguing with a rad fem and then you start hate reading and then you go, oh, this makes sense. Or if it's just you being curious and reaching out and seeing what other women like you are saying. I mean, when people put it down into conversational language, it's so much easier to understand.
mm-hmm. Yes, with radical feminism, I think her blog is a great example of why radical feminism is actually more materialistic than liberal feminism. Like, liberal feminism thrives off of ideas, while radical feminism is, being a radical feminist is being anti. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Give me a second. That was my coffee machine. Okay, so radical feminism really like thrives off of materialistic things like being anti-porn, being anti-prostitution, and being women's rights. Like, I know you work in a women's shelter, kind of like a relief shelter, I believe. And a lot of radical feminists do have that kind of job because, as I said, the personal is political. That's a huge part of our ideology. And that's really where it becomes clear where the differences lie, and why I do think that liberal feminism is ultimately the death of feminism. Like, this is the death of a movement that has achieved so many women's rights, because now, we're having all of these convoluted discussions about language and about what's right and what's wrong in language, and how we can be woke about things. And what we're really forgetting is women are not treated equally. For example, in medicine, like, women are more likely to die of a heart attack because a lot of medical professionals don't know what a heart attack looks like in women, and neither does the general populace. It's so easy to forget that oppression is actually a tangible thing. Like, these are things that we have so much connection to in our day-to-day lives, especially when it comes to porn. And I know that this also applies to, like, a lot of men. Like, they want the kind of feminism which is easy, because liberal feminism does not force them to think about what they're doing wrong when they do consume these kind of, like, images.
Yeah. And I think a lot of guys in particular are they like liberal feminism because it does benefit them. The idea, like,
Yeah.
remember with the free the nipple thing,
Mhm.
and people were protesting by walking topless down the street, and it's like, okay, the point of this was women should be able to breastfeed in public because they have kids, and the point of a breast is to feed a child, especially like if you have a
Yes.
baby, it's the point. And so they turned it into, like, I know that they thought they were doing something, but walking topless down the street just made guys go, woo, awesome. It didn't really change
Mhm.
anything.
Oh yeah, the sad part is I actually know a lot of radical feminists who do fall into that kind of trap, because with the free the nipple thing, I think that was the first time where a lot of radical feminists felt included and heard. Like, that was, and still, for example, in Germany, that's actually a very popular form of feminism, but here it's more typically connected to radical feminism, actually. And we were talking about that earlier. I did want to add that, but I kind of forgot that you said that radical feminism is more active in a bunch of countries. But for example, in Germany, the biggest women's rights organizations we have here at all, they are all radical feminists. So radical feminism being demonized by women is very new in Germany. It was demonized by men constantly. I mean, there's a reason prostitution is legal here. Like, men don't want to talk about women's rights. And if you were a feminist in Germany, basically everybody thought you were a lesbian and a hairy woman and just like a man hater, and very like the classical women's rights stereotype. And those kind of feminists were also the free the nipple feminists, at least here. And I did observe that during that time, feminists felt accepted for the first time. Actually, we have an organization here called Femen, and they do topless protests, which are very well received, but in a cool way. They organize protests for Ukraine. They're like very anti-Putin. They have a lot to do with Riot Girl, but these are actual Radfems who are extremely popular in the general society. So now that I think of it, I do think that these kind of popular topics, for example, free the nipple, can be used as a kind of easy way to sell radical feminism to liberal feminists, basically. Like, I know it's an easier way of feminism, and you're absolutely right to critique that. But now that I think of it, oh, now my dog is eating kibble.
Oh, it's fine.
um, so yeah, I do think that that's an easier way to market radical feminism and just like sell it to liberal feminists as well.
To an extent, like I get it, like it is like a diving board into feminism at large, but I just feel like in general the movement's been taken over by people who completely misunderstand what the point of it is. Like,
Hmm.
especially like for example, some women who try to argue that being super duper feminine is somehow subversive and it hurts men because they don't like it when women are super feminism, like super
Hmm.
feminist or feminine. Sorry, I use those words so often they switch up. Like for example, the bimbo trend, which as you
Oh
probably know,
yeah,
I sincerely hate,
I
or just
hate it.
like that's one of the ones that just I do not understand how you can be like, yes, pretending to be stupid is subversive. How?
Hmm.
It doesn't matter if it's your personal choice, but of course the argument is personal choice is above reproach, and especially
Hmm.
with stuff like embolification or hell, all this centering around cosmetics and all these
Hmm.
different trends that go through. They call it reclaiming, but you're not really reclaiming anything. You're not empowering yourself in any way. But it all kind of stems from it feels like activism to them because they said it.
Hmm.
They said so. They stated this is activism, so now it feels like activism. And there isn't any actual pushback because you got to consider like I don't know much about activism outside of very big things and globally in the US, but at least here
Hmm.
in the civil rights movement, you got hurt. Like if you were campaigning for civil rights, you were sprayed with hoses, you were attacked by dogs, and in my own family, like on my mom's side, someone was hung. Like there was a very real danger to working
Hmm.
towards a better world. And liberal feminism isn't dangerous. There is no danger to it. Even with like the no means no thing. I mean, I understand the gist of it, but it misunderstands why men rape. It's not because they don't know that no means no, it's because they choose to ignore it. You don't necessarily
Yeah.
have to say no for someone to realize you're not into it or that you don't want to do something. They know they're not stupid. Men are not stupid. They may act like it, but they're not. And
Yeah.
a lot of this issue just kind of reigns around a misunderstanding of what oppression is and of how to act against it. And I think a
Hmm.
good part of that is just like a lot of people don't want to take risks. I mean, I'm very grateful to everyone who speaks to me on my channel. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we're at risk for people doxing anyone because, like I meant, I'm super small. But there is a certain risk to putting a name or a face or whatever to saying sex is real or that, women are oppressed. And a
Hmm.
lot of people don't want to do that. They don't want to take a risk and potentially get hurt over trying to change the world.
Yes, we've come full circle. We are right back at the equal validity theory kind of thing where, first of all, I agree. This whole bimbo trend it's awful. I cannot believe that oh my God, Dworkin must be spinning in her grave right now. We've arrived at a point where women think that a pornified version of yourself is something that you can choose under the guise of feminism. Like, that Atwood sighting where she's basically like, we are all a man living inside of a woman's head, observing a woman. And it's very hard to combat that and to really work on not having that dynamic inside of your own brain anymore, where you're constantly trying to live up to this pornified, constantly available version of yourself. So now, again, we want to be comfortable in our forms of activism. And if you're a woman, being comfortable also means being classically feminine. And I mean, you know me, right? Like, I wear makeup and I also am a more feminine kind of lesbian, but I do see these things extremely critically, and it really hurts me to see women who are damaging themselves with surgery that is so dangerous. Just like, for example, the Brazilian butt lift, which is totally connected to this whole bimbo thing, right? Where you're undergoing really dangerous surgery and you're putting your life at risk just so your life won't be at risk for activism, basically. It's just so contradictory to me that women are forcing themselves to go to such great lengths to basically adhere to societal standards in order to not be hurt. But the consequence of that is ultimately you are hurting yourself. And I think that feminism really has to evolve past that point again, or we're not going to get anywhere. Like, women are losing their rights in America because feminism has become so toothless. Like, feminism doesn't bite anymore. Feminism doesn't have that kind of punching power because now all men see, and that's why a lot of men do like feminism and call themselves feminists now, is okay, well, this is a movement where women are doing exactly what I expect them to do, and they think I'm righteous for applauding them for it. It's comfortable, which is honestly sad and can really provoke like kind of thoughts of doom, just like feelings of impending doom. Like, is this ever going to get better? I think there is a lot of hope because we're speaking to each other right now, and I know so many brilliant women who are just doing amazing career paths and steps in their lives where they're also helping other women and girls. A friend of mine is a teacher, and I'm just so proud of the women I know for doing everything they can to not be complicit in their own oppression, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you put that very well. I don't want to keep you on forever. It's been an hour about already. But thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me and for bringing your expertise into philosophy and theory because that's definitely an area that I lack, and it was really nice to hear from someone who knows what they're talking about.
Thank you so much for having me. It was amazing to talk to you.
You have anything else you'd like to say before I cut off the recording?
Um, I don't think so.
All right. Well, again, thank you for speaking with me.